Have you ever found yourself in a conversation where you start out feeling 100% certain about something, but you walk away just feeling totally confused, maybe even questioning your own sanity? Well, if that sounds familiar, you've probably been caught in what's known as the doubt loop. And in this explainer, we're not just going to talk about what it is, we are going to take apart the psychological architecture of this whole thing, piece by piece.
You see, the most striking thing about the doubt loop isn't that it convinces you that you're wrong. No, it's way more insidious than that. It works by making the simple act of being certain feel like a symptom of mental instability. You know, we usually think a manipulator is going to try to sell you a lie, right? But in these really high-pressure situations, something far more sophisticated is going on. Your own natural biological drive for intellectual honesty, for self-reflection, gets turned against you.
So how in the world does someone who claims to be all nuanced and open-minded end up making you feel like your own memory is some kind of symptom of your own unhealth? Well, this is the core paradox of what we call metacognitive sabotage. It's that exact moment when your best qualities, your desire to be fair, to see all sides, are weaponized and turned into the very mechanism of your own psychological paralysis. This isn't just a disagreement. It's a hijacking of your ability to think about your own thoughts.
All right, so to really understand this kind of psychological paralysis, we need a roadmap. We're going to cover 5 key areas. First up, we'll dive into the certainty paradox, which is all about how your own conviction becomes the problem. Then, we'll define the tools of metacognitive hijacking. After that, we'll dissect the 3-step pattern of paralysis. Fourth, we're going to uncover the ultimate goal here, interpretive control. And finally, we'll get into the practical tools you need to reclaim your reality.
So, let's kick things off with stage 1, the certainty paradox. How is an environment actually created where your own clarity of thought isn't just questioned, but it's treated like it's some kind of character flaw? Well, it's not random. This dynamic is specifically cultivated, and it thrives in very specific situations where ambiguity can basically be used as a weapon. This whole dynamic is fueled by a cognitive shift called epistemic friction, and you can really think of it as someone intentionally throwing sand in the gears of your perception. What's fascinating is where this tends to pop up. In so-called intellectualized families, a simple request like, "Hey, please don't speak to me that way," can get twisted into an hour-long philosophical debate about the subjective nature of tone. Or in professional settings with really vague rules, nobody can ever feel secure because the goalposts are always moving, right? It makes you constantly second-guess yourself. And in these enmeshed relationships, a controller keeps you off balance by making sure you can never, ever land on a firm conclusion about what you're experiencing.
And this process, it fundamentally shifts your identity. As you can see here, you go from being an active observer who trusts your gut, trusts your senses, to becoming a passive analyst, just stuck in this endless loop of trying to prove you're not biased or rigid. Your own perception, which should be your anchor to reality, gets replaced. You become a self-correcting subject, hyper-focused on proving how fair you are to the very person who's destabilizing you. And here's the sneakiest part. Your own unhappiness stops being a valid signal that something is wrong. Instead, it gets reframed as a misinterpretation, a cognitive error that you need to fix.
Okay, so let's move on to how this cage is actually built. To really get a handle on the doubt loop, we need to understand the precise psychological and, biological tools used to construct it. These aren't just abstract ideas. They are targeted attacks on your brain's most basic functions of making sense of the world and trusting yourself.
We've already mentioned the foundation of this whole thing, epistemic friction, but let's look closer. It's a state where your brain's natural ability to check facts, trust what you see, and come to a conclusion is intentionally messed with, over and over again. It's like your mental wheels are just spinning in the mud. This constant state of, "Am I seeing this right?" completely overloads you. The friction isn't there to resolve confusion. Its whole purpose is to manufacture it, which makes you way more suggestible and, frankly, easier to control.
And now we get to the core of it all, metacognitive hijacking. This targets your metacognition, your ability to think about your own thinking. And listen, this is a biological fact. Our brains are wired for accuracy and for social cohesion. For thousands of years, being wrong about the group's reality could literally mean death. So it is nearly impossible to stand your ground and defend a boundary if you've been convinced that your very perception of that boundary is flawed. Your brain's ancient, hardwired self-correction drive gets weaponized against you. So what does this hijacking actually feel like on the inside? Well, it creates 2 really powerful, recurring patterns. First, there's the reflective hook.
This is that seductive idea that being certain is somehow simplistic or primitive, the sign of a rigid, unevolved mind. It's brilliant because it hooks into the desire of smart, conscientious people to be seen as open-minded. And second, there's cognitive stuttering. This is a physical experience. It's that paralyzing feeling of redrafting a single sentence in your head 10 times, just terrified you'll say it wrong and prove that you are in fact the biased, unreasonable one.
And that brings us to the mechanism itself. Look, this isn't just a random series of confusing conversations. What we're talking about here is a systematic, repeatable, three-step pattern. It's a tactical sequence that's designed to methodically hijack your internal reasoning.
And the sequence is remarkably consistent. It always starts with the nuance strike, which introduces a bunch of false complexity. Then comes the bias accusation, which reframes your perception as some kind of personal failing. And finally, the recursive loop traps you by using your own desire to be fair against you. So let's break down each step.
Okay, now look at this slide closely. On the left, you've got the tactic. On the right, you've got your brain's predictable response. So, step 1. The nuance strike. A controller takes a simple, clear event, let's say they were an hour late, and they introduce false complexity. They'll say things like, well, it's a bit more nuanced than that, or you have to consider my perspective. This immediately triggers your brain to test its own certainty, making you feel simplistic for having a clear boundary. Then comes step 2, the bias accusation. Once you're already off balance, they rebrand your memory or your feeling as emotional reactivity. Your clear observation that they were late is now suddenly a symptom of your anxiety or your past trauma. And this triggers your brain's powerful self-correction drive, and you start wondering, wait, am I overreacting? Is my past filtering the truth here?
And this is where the trap snaps shut. In your attempt to be fair and intellectually honest, thanks to that reflective hook we talked about earlier, you try to consider their nuanced perspective. But the moment you do that, you implicitly invalidate your own initial perception. The controller then uses your own open-mindedness against you, saying something like, see? Even you admit it's not so simple. You were just confused before. Your attempt to be a good person becomes the final piece of evidence used to prove that your initial, correct perception was wrong. It is a brilliant and absolutely devastating closed loop. The long-term consequence of living inside this loop is something called epistemic erosion. This is a sustained state where you literally stop noticing red flags. It's not that you don't see them, it's that your brain has been conditioned to believe that the very act of noticing is a projection of your own internal flaws. You actually become ashamed of your own convictions, automatically treating your certainty as a moral failure, and this endless paralyzing self-analysis as a sign of intellectual maturity. So you have to ask, why? Why does this happen? What is the ultimate goal of trapping somebody in a doubt loop? I'll tell you. It's not just about winning an argument or avoiding blame for being late. The motivation is way more fundamental, and it seeks a much, much greater prize.
The ultimate goal is total interpretive control. If someone can systematically break your trust in your own thinking process, in your own eyes and ears, they gain absolute leverage over you. You can never hold them accountable for anything because you can never be fully sure that you're interpreting the situation correctly. You lose the ability to say with any conviction, no, that's not what happened, or even more importantly, no, that is not okay with me. And this slide just illustrates the power exchange perfectly. Your core vulnerability is your own virtue, your deep need for intellectual integrity, your desire to be a fair, thoughtful person. The leverage they gain is that the controller becomes the official interpreter of reality for both of you. You get demoted to the role of the unreliable narrator in your own life story. And tragically, you can get conditioned to value being fair to the person destabilizing you more than you value being safe for yourself, which just locks you in this self-eroding dynamic.
Okay, now that we've really analyzed the cage, let's talk about how to find the key. The way out of the doubt loop isn't to argue harder or to try and analyze your way out. It's about shifting your awareness and stepping outside of its rules entirely. So let's look at some practical tools for reclaiming your own perceptual sovereignty.
The first tool is a really simple diagnostic test called the complexity audit. The next time someone introduces nuance or context that leaves you feeling confused and small and exhausted, just ask yourself this one powerful question. Is this context genuinely helping to clarify the situation, or is it a smokescreen designed to hide a simple, uncomfortable truth? You see, true nuance brings clarity. False nuance just manufactures confusion, and the goal is to learn the difference.
The second tool is called literalist data awareness. This is all about consciously disengaging from the rules of the loop.
First, you refuse to get drawn into debates about abstract, unknowable things like their intent or your supposed bias. Second, you anchor yourself by sticking strictly to the literal observable events, not why they were late, but they arrived at 3 p.m. for a 2 p.m. meeting. Third, you learn to recognize that feeling of second-guessing, not as a sign you're wrong, but as a conditioned biological response. And finally, you internalize this mantra: I don't need to be unbiased to be correct. You are allowed to have a history, you're allowed to have a perspective, and still be right about what you saw.
Ultimately, reclaiming your reality really starts with learning to trust your first thought again, that initial, clear perception you had before all the layers of nuanced and biased accusations started piling on. That first thought is raw data. Your mind is a private territory, and awareness is the #1 tool you have to make sure that someone else's manufactured complexity doesn't become a cage for your autonomy.
And that brings us to our final and maybe most powerful takeaway. The entire cycle of the doubt loop is interrupted the very moment you realize that you do not need to earn the right to your own perception. You don't have to consider all sides or prove your objectivity just to validate the simple facts that are standing right in front of you. Your eyes do not need a philosophical justification.